And we are back with another George update video, as per tradition on this channel, with some of the news on the Dunk and Egg side of things. For those of you who don't know, the Tales of Dunk and Egg are a series of short stories in the Game of Thrones universe centered around an honorable knight traveling Westeros with his squire who just happens to be a Targaryen prince. The stories takes place about 90 years before Game of Thrones and is lauded as one of the best stories George has ever written. And because of that, fans are excited about HBO doing an adaptation of it, and George has seen some footage and, according to him, we're in for a good time. Naturally, we'll be covering all of that and more on this channel, so be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, comment, all that good stuff, and yeah, let's get into it. So, a couple of days ago, our boy George put out a blog post about the status of the show and how pleased he is with the adaptation. This is what he had to say. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, for starts, it's done. Ira Parker, the showrunner, and his team wrapped the first season months ago and moved right on to post-production. I've seen all 6 episodes now, the last 2 in rough cuts, and love them. Dunk and Egg have always been favorites of mine, and the actors we found to portray them are just incredible. The rest of the cast are terrific as well. Wait until you guys meet the Laughing Storm and Tansel Too-Tall. Now, this is good news, especially if you guys recall the George vs. Ryan Condal saga from last year, something we covered extensively on this channel about how annoyed he was with House of the Dragon veering off course from the books. And speaking of that, some people thought George took a small shot at House of the Dragon showrunner Ryan Condal in this blog post when he said, "A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is an adaptation of The Hedge Knight, the first of the novellas I wrote about them, yada yada. It's as faithful as an adaptation as a reasonable man could hope for. And you all know how incredibly reasonable I am on this particular subject." Now, for those of you who don't remember, again, last year in September, George wrote a blog post that he quickly deleted titled Toxic Butterflies, in which he complained that House of the Dragon was not staying faithful to the source material. If you'd like to check out the breakdown of that video, I'll leave a link in the description below. Now, I know some people would disagree with George on him being a reasonable guy, and I'll leave that for Preston to dissect later, but I don't blame anybody for thinking he was taking shots at Condal, who hasn't been staying faithful to the source material, and I agree with that. In fact, there was an interview that Condal did months ago that we have yet to cover on this channel, in which he explains why he made the changes to the show that he did. Again, we haven't covered this yet, but we will, along with another big interview that largely flew under the radar. Stay tuned for that. The last bit of news is that we're getting a Dunk and Egg story, but not the one you'd expect. This is what George had to say. Meanwhile, we'll be moving on to The Sworn Sword, the second tale of Dunk and Egg. He's referring to the second season of the show. And once I finish The Winds of Winter, I will need to get hopping on The Village Hero and all the other tales that await the lads. Now, people who have been following these stories will note that the next one was supposed to be The She-Wolves of Winterfell, but apparently George has switched it up and is planning on doing The Village Hero first. I want to be optimistic and think that George finished She-Wolves and is waiting to release it, but the most likely explanation is that he's pushing it back, which I'm fine with. Someone on social asked me why I think that is, and the likely explanation is probably because Village Hero is easier to write than She-Wolves. How do I know this? Well, She-Wolves of Winterfell obviously involves the North, Winterfell, the Starks, and other major and minor houses, and all these other important characters. There's a lot of extra planning involved and a bunch of thought put into that versus a simple story about Dunk visiting a village somewhere in the Riverlands and helping out with some trouble. It seems much easier to bang out a smaller scale story than something with bigger stakes or something that will require more effort on George's part. That's not me calling George lazy, that's me calling him busy, something he loves reminding us, even in this blog post. And of course, before I forget this, in this very same blog post, George again mentions how he had this whole speech prepared at Bubonicon last year where he visited Tolkien's grave, and he was first talking about how he was annoyed with House of the Dragon Season 2, and I'm actually surprised he's this bummed about not having that appearance on tape, because this is either the 3rd or 4th time he's mentioned it. Don't worry, though, because I was able to talk to someone who attended that convention, and we did a whole video on that, which I will link in the description below. I highly recommend it because George goes into a lot of deep stuff, and this was one of the first times in public that he was open about his dislike of House of the Dragon Season 2 and where it was going. And finally, the last bit of news involving this blog post is of George unknowingly sharing a fake trailer to Dunk and Egg from a channel that is known to clickbait with trailers. I need to reiterate this for the people in the back who have a listening problem. There is, as of this recording, no official trailer for Dunk and Egg. That YouTube channel in question just took the teaser that's already out there, spliced in some AI, and the result was convincing enough to fool a lot of people. I know some of you guys love to throw the word clickbait around, but On YouTube, the actual definition of clickbait is putting something in the title or thumbnail that is not true or doesn't appear in the video, and in this case, it was clickbait. I don't fault George or even the creator of that channel, but mainly YouTube, who should be doing a better job at labeling this type of content what it is. And before I wrap this up, I do want to let you guys know that I attached a clip of a discussion Preston and I did about this blog post, and even had our own little debate on it. If you're curious about that whole thing, then the full discussion is available now over on Patreon and YouTube memberships. It's only $1 to join if you'd like to support the channel, myself, or even the podcast that we do, and get a little extra for it. Again, starting tier is just $1, so head on over to patreon.com/RedTeamReview, or check out the links in the description below. If you don't plan on watching the clip of our discussion after this, then as always, thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel over the years, and I hope you guys stick with me for all of 2025 and beyond. Enjoy. And while we're on that topic, real quick, I wanted to bring up your video briefly before I let you go. Great video. As always, great video. People love your scripted stuff. There is one thing you didn't account for, and that I think that's, because you're right. As George was finishing up Dance, he talked about it, right? But that was a different world before the fame, before the glory, before the women, specifically the Shay actress, whose name always escapes me. I firmly believe that George is a different person now. If he was close to finishing Winds, I don't think he would be talking about it all the time. Now, my question to you is this. You firmly believe that if George was close to finishing Winds, he'd be doing the same thing he did with Dance. Okay, fine. But we know, you know for a fact, that George wrote quite a bit of the World of Ice and Fire and of Fire. Was it a World of Ice and Fire or Fire and Blood? Because I remember you contacting Elio, asking him who wrote this.
Oh, the World of Ice and Fire.
So
I contacted Elio asking about some Vale lore. Yeah.
Gotcha. So obviously, I mean, the World of Ice and Fire, let's be real here. It's like a stuff we already know, and you made a very good point. Anything important about Ashai or, other locations were left ambiguous on purpose because George probably wanted to revisit that. But it was mostly Elio and Linda coming in and doing their own lore and putting it in there. But according to Elio...
Yeah, specifically for the Essos chapters, yeah.
Right. But according to Elio, George did, put a lot of time and effort into that book. Are we familiar with his writing process on World of Ice and Fire? Was he as active about finishing it and writing it on his blogs as he was with Dance?
So what had happened was the World of Ice and Fire took actually a very long time to come together. It was many years before, like, Elio had, even before I think Feast was published, Elio had spitballed the idea, hey, you should do like a lore book as like a coffee table book or something. And George is like, yeah, maybe. And then, they got in touch with the publishers and everything, and they're like, okay, I think we can do this. And, at first, like, all Elio was going to do was take, like, the books themselves and organize all the lore. And then George had also a bunch of material. He had written material for Princess and the Queen and the Book of Swords, and that's Sons of the Dragon and the Rogue Prince. And so they're like, oh, we could do some Targaryen history in here. Okay, we'll have a Targaryen history section based on like your short stories for on Targaryen, on Targaryen history. And then we've got this stuff about the world, and that's based on the books themselves, The Song of Ice and Fire. And then Elio and Linda decide to kind of do their own creation with the Essos kind of chapters. And they're running by George, and they're like, oh, can we include, like, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And then George starts writing these actual blurbs with his actual language. So they came up with the idea, okay, why don't we just say that these blurbs are actually from like Gildain? And then he kept supplying more and more of these blurbs every time Elio asked a question. And then that's why the World of Ice and Fire is filled with all these like asides, because that each of those was essentially like Elio reaching out and saying, hey, can you give us more information on X? And George saying, sure. And then he would give something and then be like, well, let's just put it in verbatim, you know.
Actually, yeah, Elio complained about, didn't really complain, but he commented on that, how George would just add like way more than they were really contracted to do. That was in his interview.
Yes.
But okay, fine. In regards to the Fire and Blood, did George actively blog about that? Did he actively comment on his progress regarding it? Because, again, according to Elio and Linda, most of that was George.
I mean, he commented some on it. I won't say like he wrote like, oh, working on Fire and Blood today, so excited, you know, stuck on this chapter. But, you know, keep in mind that like what he had to write for Fire and Blood was essentially the Jaehaerys story and stuff like that. I don't know. I mean, he never wrote about being stuck or spending time on it or his mind being in it. He never has a blog about being haunted, you know, like he does with Ice and Fire. You know, it occupying his thoughts. So I understand what you're asking. You're asking, okay, George was silent on Fire and Blood, or doesn't talk that much about Fire and Blood progress, and it comes out and it's huge. Can't he do the same thing for Ice and Fire?
Yeah.
I mean, is that's more or less what you're asking?
Basically, what I'm saying is that George R.R. Martin, before the publication of A Dance of Dragons, is a completely different person than George R.R. Martin today, post Game of Thrones season 1 fame, if you will, or the success. Okay. He's constantly busy. He's doing all this stuff. He loves to talk about how busy he is. In fact, I want to remind you of this one recording we did, and I'm sure you forgot. It's one of my biggest shorts on my channel. It's when George put out a blog post a couple years ago about how busy he is, and you commented, it's kind of like your ex-girlfriend breaking up with you, but telling you, don't worry, I found a new guy, and he has a really big dick. Remember that when you said that?
Yeah. Yes.
So he's a different guy now. He's busy. He probably doesn't have enough time to blog. In fact, in this blog post, he even said, I wish there was a lot of stuff I would want to write about, but I'm just too busy to keep you guys up to date with what I want to say.